We will kick this off. So everybody, welcome to Apathy's webinar. We have leading and maintaining a high-performing chapter. I'm Mackenzie Lalka, and I serve AKSI as the Associate Director of Education. Today, I'll be moderating the webcast. So before we dive into the content, just a few housekeeping details. All participants have been started with their microphones muted and their videos turned off. We are going to ask that you keep yourself muted if you're not talking and during the presentation so we can hear our presenter. But if you would like to go ahead and turn your video on so other participants and the presenter can see you, you are welcome to do so. We do have the chat feature open and available for you to interact with others, and it's going to share your name, but also consider mentioning your chapter or your university as well. At the end of the presentation, we are going to open to Q&A, so you can either submit that via the chat feature, or at that time, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question verbally, you can do so then. So at this point, for our program today, we do have past president Mike Dickerson, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to him to get started.
All right, thanks, Mackenzie, and thank you everyone for being here. This is leading and maintaining a high-performing chapter, and just as a reminder, today is Tuesday, April 28th, 2020. Make sure I'm reminded of that every day. And over the course of this presentation, we're going to talk about a few things. The description was very, very broad, but really we're going to focus in on what the chapter roles really mean. This goes beyond what you learn in officer training. Talk about identifying issues and size fluctuations, how to manage those. And finally, how to identify red flags leading to apathy and increased motivation in your current members. Now, keep in mind, a lot of this is based upon the old school thinking of AKSI, where chapters meet in person, schools are in session, understanding things are different now with everyone at home doing everything remotely. But a lot of these practices and ideas could be used in your virtual chapters going forward. So, the first thing I want to talk about today are chapter management roles. And there are 4 types of roles in a chapter. And I don't mean officer and chair and member and pledge. Those are types of positions in the organization. But we're talking about here are types of management roles. The first one is strategic. Now, when I say strategic, I'm not talking about actually doing stuff. And this is one of the biggest pitfalls that a chapter president, in some cases also an EVP, falls into, and that's they try to do the job of the people that they're leading. Strategic management means that you are responsible for getting everyone going in the same direction to do something at a very, very macro level. The chapter has to have 5 professional events and initiate 15 members this semester. Those are our goals. That is our strategic goal for this semester. Over the next year, we're going to be graduating 30 seniors. How do we plan for backfilling them, making sure that we don't go too far down in size where it hurts operations next year? That's strategic management. Next, we move to functional management. Now, the functional managers in a chapter are typically the officers that aren't the president and the EVP, and they actually do a function. Your VP of Finance does the finances, the treasurer. Master Rituals does the rituals. VP of Education or Administration or whatever you want to call it does those specific functions. They're responsible for that function. In the case of, let's say, VP of Administration, it could be the person that books your rooms and also doubles in the role of the secretary, taking on those functional roles, make sure the paperwork is done properly. But when we say function, we're talking about a broad stroke of what the organization at the chapter level does. It does finances, it does education, it does membership stuff, it does alumni stuff, it does ritual stuff. But within that, to meet the goals of that function, you get onto the project management level. And these are the committee chair. Some chapters call them director, some chapters call them something else. But the bottom line is, it's not the typical elected officers that you have in a chapter. These are the people that are responsible for a project. They are responsible for all the professional events that a chapter does over the course of a semester, and you do one of those. So your job is the big event in the middle of the semester where you pair with another organization to bring a speaker to campus. And within that project management function, there are the logistics and the resource management and the human resource management allocations that you have to do to get that going forward. It's basic project management. These projects all happen within a function. So the function of professional development, VP professional, might be responsible for all the faculty stuff and all the professional development stuff and the career stuff. So when we're talking about project management, that's what we mean. But task management is where the actual day-to-day stuff gets done. These are the members. Later on, we'll talk about motivation, but the key thing to keep in mind is the chapter from a leadership standpoint is a pyramid in the sense that you hopefully have less officers than you have members, meaning that you depend on getting your members to actually do stuff and attend stuff and contribute to the organization to make it successful. And without doing that properly, the organization will fail because either the officers will do everything and burn themselves out, or things will get dropped, and you won't be able to get the chapter where you want it to go strategically. So you see how it all kind of works together. But we talked about tax execution. Let's talk about members for a quick second. Members have a very important role. And it's a misnomer that people think, well, I'm just a brother, that I don't have a role in the chapter because I'm not a chair or an officer or the president or whomever. I can tell you from experience that I have held a lot of positions now for Kappa Psi over my nearly 20 years in the organization. And regardless of what that position is, it all ends, but I'm still a brother. And so at the chapter level, number one role of a member is be faithful in attendance to the meetings of the chapter. This is actually what you say when you are initiated as a member as part of your oath. You will go to meetings. Understanding that now in the time of COVID, meetings are virtual and are not really happening right now, that is an exception to the rule. Assuming that we're all back on campus in the fall, you're going to have 2 to 4 meetings a month as a chapter, and your job is to go to those meetings because in order to get the business of Alpha Kappa Psi done properly, you have to be an active member. But a big thing that members have to do is, if you can, provide ideas, don't just complain. I know that there are people out there who can think of probably a handful of people off the top of their head that come to meetings, complain about what's going on or what's being said or what's being done or what's not being done. And then when asked, well, what would you do about it? They don't have anything really constructive to say. They'll push back and say, well, that's your job. You're in charge. So if you're an active, good member of Alpha Kappa Psi and you have a complaint, if you can follow up with an idea, that's good. Sometimes you just can't. And that's why an issue is brought up. But just keep that in mind that a good member usually has ideas and isn't just problems. And like I said, be an active participant. Come to meetings, come to events. You pay dues. Your members pay dues. And to get a good ROI for their payment to Alpha Kappa Psi, they need to actually come to things. A lot of members that resign or quit or demit, because demit means to quit, will say, well, they didn't do anything I wanted to do. And so later on, we'll talk about getting your members fighting apathy, but finding out what it is that they want to do and then doing it will help keep your members active and actually coming to things. And a member also needs to do what it is they say they're going to do. Even if it's coming to a meeting or being part of a committee, it's very, very easy for someone to say, it's not my job, it's someone else's job, throw their hands up, and then all of a sudden the work piles up. The higher up the org chart you go. But regardless of what position you hold in Alpha Kappa Psi, the most important position is a member. I have been chapter advisor, regional manager, section director, all the way up to fraternity president. And underlying all that is I'm a member of the organization first. And if you fall into the trap of thinking that I am my position versus I am a member of Alpha Kappa Psi, then you're going to have a real hard time going on when that position time ends. And believe me, they all end, and it's okay. So now that we've talked about what the different types of management positions in the chapter are, let's talk about how we apply that to managing size fluctuations. I understand that we as an organization are going to lose members over the course of the summer and going into the fall semester. It is a fact of life that universities meeting virtually and changing everything around is going to hurt student organization membership. Alpha Kappa Psi, especially with Brotherhood Unbounded, has done a really, really good job of trying to make us go virtual. The organization is focusing very hard on making sure that while we are focusing on recruitment in the fall, we're going to focus a lot on retention of current members too. But chapter sizes will change. Let's talk about that. Let's go over some numbers first. 100% and 4. This, on average, says that about every 4 years, 100% of a chapter's membership will turn over. That means that 4 years from now, not a single person who's in the chapter then will have been in the chapter right now. Which means that regardless of whether or not you have an old chapter like Alpha at NYU or a brand new chapter, your membership base is relatively young. At most, it's 3 or 4 years if you're an older chapter like that. And so these things happen in chapters. They go up, they go down, they grow, they shrink. They have good leaders, they have bad leaders, and we deal with it. Other numbers. Within the organization, Alpha Kappa Psi chapters span the gamut of sizes. We have 3 chapters that are 6 members right now. We have 1 chapter, Florida State, that's 220 members right now. Now that's as of a couple weeks ago. That's a big difference in chapter size. But everything can be managed properly if you plan ahead and understand what your limitations and your resources are that you can use to basically take those numbers and make it a rewarding time for your members. So I know it's an eye chart. I'm not going to go over every single line because I know you can read. You passed the pledge test with at least a C, so therefore you're good to go with reading. But benefits and limitations of increasing in size, going from smaller to large. To personal experience, when I pledged my chapter, Beta Xi, we were 43 members. When I graduated 2 years later, we were 110. The chapter grew a lot in the 2 years I was in there. And not because I was such a good person at Rush and recruitment, even though I was, because, you know, who wouldn't want to join Alpha Kappa Psi talking to me? But it's because people understood the value of the fraternity and what it brought to them. A couple of things to think about that's a benefit of increasing in size is you have more money. Money is what gets you free shirts at recruitment. It gets you food at events. It gets you the ability to potentially be one of those chapters that has a refreshment stand at a sporting event because you have to buy into it. It also makes it less emphasis on pledging, more emphasis on membership and less stress on your members. You're not forcing everyone to go to everything to make it so that you can actually execute the events properly. You'll see on here, the second to last line, a benefit of increasing in size is you have a lot of opinions about stuff, a lot of diverse ideas to pull from and get ideas on programming and events. But a limitation is you also have a lot of opinions. Things get harder the larger you get. That's just a fact of life, and that's okay. Chapters can be very creative in how they manage it. And there's nothing saying that you can be a small chapter of 6 members and manage yourself in the way you need to manage yourself, or a large chapter of 200 plus and reorganize and have a diverse org chart with lots of positions of leadership and people who have authority to execute those roles. Make it so that they have the ability to grow. The last line here is the benefit is more programming. You can do a lot more with a lot more people. Limitation is it's more planning and coordination. A lot of this has to do with getting a room that's the right size or making sure that people understand, oh, well, this works with this schedule, but not this schedule. Might be a big class that meets on Monday night or something like that. Point is, for this slide, getting bigger doesn't necessarily mean everything's going to be better. And just like with decreasing size, getting smaller doesn't necessarily mean things are getting worse. It's okay. A couple of years ago, the fraternity decided to change the minimum standard for chapter size to what the regional director decided your year-end size should be, based upon how many people were graduating, how many people you expected to leave the chapter or be suspended, and what your desired pledge goal was going to be, not a set number based upon an arbitrary figure. So you're getting smaller. As long as your RD works with you on that, that's okay. So you have the option to reorg your chapter. You don't want to have a chapter of 30 people and an e-board of 20. That's a lot. It's too many people in charge and not enough people actually doing a lot of the work. You also have an opportunity to have a spotlight on individual members. This week, we're going to focus on Julie here, who's going to lead us through something that she is passionate about. But you also have some limitations too. You really have to pick and choose what events you're going to hold because you don't want to burn people out. You can't go at the same rate with the same number of people doing the same things over and over again with a smaller chapter. It's just not possible along with schoolwork. Now, granted, in the time of COVID, where we are right now, it's even harder to do events, but just assume, again, we're back at school on campus. A benefit is communication improves. It's easier to talk to a chapter of 20 or 30 people because you get to know people a little bit better than a chapter of 200. It's not really possible to know 200 people really, really well. In fact, there's a funny story. It's not AK Psi, but there was a social Greek organization at a university, and these two members got into a physical altercation downtown at their town, and they didn't even know they were in the same fraternity. That's how big that organization was. So there is a thought that a bigger chapter means a closer or a less close brotherhood. If you don't manage it properly, that could be an issue, but it's all about identifying with the organization, not just with members. But does chapter size really matter in Alpha Kappa Psi? No. I have heard for years that we want quantity over or quality over quantity, but you can do both. This is Alpha Kappa Psi. These are good universities. We don't go to bad universities. There are a lot of schools out there that would love to have a chapter of Alpha Kappa Psi that we will not send any team to start a chapter, because it's not the quality of members that we want. So if you can assume safely that if we have a chapter at your school, there are quality people at that school to make your chapter the size that's appropriate for your university. A Florida State, for example, has tens of thousands of students, so a chapter of 200 makes sense. A smaller school, like let's say American University, where I'm currently the chapter advisor, has less than that, and their chapter is smaller, and that's okay. It depends on what makes sense for your chapter for your school. But don't fall into the trap of, if we have too many members, we're going to lose our quality. That's not the case. So some best practices to think about. Whether or not you're going larger to smaller or smaller to larger, some things to keep in mind are you don't want to overcomplicate the structure if you're smaller. Alpha Kappa Psi has a base structure that we provide to all our chapters with 7 officers. With the exception of those 3 that only have 6 members, you don't need to have a VP of posters. That's the generic term people use for officer positions that are created for the benefit of a chapter beyond the base 7. But if you're a larger chapter, you might want to have a VP of something else, because it ensures that you can increase opportunity for members to get involved. The more members you have, the more opportunity you have for them to get involved at a larger chapter level, because you can do more. And remember, people join Alpha Kappa Psi because of the brotherhood and because they want the experience for their resumes. But you have to be able to give them that experience to actually feel like they're getting good ROI on their membership. You also, as a smaller chapter, understand that recruitment is constant. You're always recruiting. Wearing letters on campus is great. Telling people, hey, by the way, we are doing our recruitment week these 2 weeks next fall. We would love for you to join and come out. In a larger chapter, not necessarily as important, only because you're not looking at members to do more stuff. But in a larger chapter, you have to make sure you communicate. It's very, very hard to keep everyone in the same page on the same book when you are a 200-person chapter. It can be done. It's been done successfully for a long time, but you have to focus on that a lot. But we talk about focusing on things, and a lot of these things we focus on are these unspoken issues. I've spoken to a lot of chapter presidents over the years, and I remind them that in the bylaws of the organization, they have 4 jobs: run the meetings, make tie-breaking votes, vote for convention delegate and alternate, and vote on membership and discipline. That's it. But if you're a chapter president, I can tell you from experience that there's a lot of stuff that you will have to do and have to deal with that are not written down. So what are unspoken issues? They're things that make you uncomfortable. They're the things that people need to talk about, that you feel that sense of dread for having to discuss with them or give them some bad news. It's really the unfun part of the job. If you are in a leadership position in any organization, telling someone they're not doing something well or hearing their complaints about something you're trying very hard at is difficult. These are not the things that are written down anywhere, but these are the things that everyone has to deal with, and they're unspoken. So how do you deal with that? Well, keep in mind, Alpha Kappa Psi leadership means you're managing people. We don't build stuff. We don't have factories anywhere. We don't create widgets or whatever the business textbooks will say as the generic thing that a factory makes. We manage people. And managing people means you manage their personality. Some people are intrinsically motivated. Some people aren't. Some people are really into community service. Some people are really into professional events. But managing personalities doesn't mean managing positions. What I mean by this is you can't just go to someone and say, thou shalt do this because I am the vice president of professional. That is not how it works in Alpha Kappa Psi. This is a volunteer organization from the top down, including at the chapter level. In fact, you pay to be here. As a member of Alpha Kappa Psi, you are paying money to be part of an organization that it really is a volunteer basis. If you leave the organization, you will not go bankrupt or destitute or homeless or hungry. So you got to understand that people are motivated by different things. This is not the military. I work at the Pentagon. I can tell you, people say, sir, ma'am, all the time over there. It's not that. So you have to use your authority wisely. Positions in Alpha Kappa Psi have intrinsic authority in them based upon the roles that they have to execute. But those roles sometimes go beyond just what's written down. And so understanding that you have to put the chapter first, organization first, matters. And that's where the unspoken issue of exec being a cohesive team, like a collaboration of talent, comes in. Everyone on exec ran for a position. So in Alpha Kappa Psi, your first line of defense is your chapter advisor. I'm doing my fourth stint as a chapter advisor in my nearly 2 decades in AKSI, and I can tell you that every time is different, every chapter is different, but the benefit of a chapter advisor is it provides that neutral outside body that can provide a clear advice that's not emotionally invested, that can see things with a bigger picture, and also provide continuity between executive boards. Understand what motivates people is the job of both an advisor and also of you. If someone's motivated because they feel like they want to be needed to do something, and you know you need to get something done, give it to that person. All of a sudden, they're motivated to successfully execute that role. And finally, speak truth to power. That is a big deal in AKSI. I was speaking to someone recently, and actually they were my boss, and they asked me my opinion on something, and I had to tell them, these are my thoughts. It wasn't what they wanted to hear, but if you say what's true, it doesn't really matter if it's hard to hear, because the worst thing to do is lie about it or fudge it or do something that isn't actually clear, and then someone does the wrong thing anyway. Speak truth to power matters in Alpha Kappa Psi. Doesn't mean being disrespectful, but it means making sure that whoever's making the decision has all the information they require. Sometimes it means if someone comes to you with a personal issue and says, I don't know what I should do, the power in that situation is they're making a decision. You have the ability to speak truth to them. So now we talked about the building blocks of the organization, managing fluctuations in size, but how do we fight apathy? Apathy is a big problem in Alpha Kappa Psi. With the amount of members that we take in every single year, we hypothetically should be bigger than we are, but we're not because people drop off, and that's just how it's been since the organization was founded. So the top 3 reasons for apathy in the fraternity: number one, pledging was a lie. We sold them a bill of goods that the chapter or the fraternity did something, and we don't do it. Let's say we have a really close brotherhood and everyone's friends here, but then they become a member and they realize that everyone is very gossipy and backstabby. So hopefully our chapters aren't like that, but if that's the case, they were sold a bill of goods of a tight brotherhood, and that's not what they got. The second one is they don't need me. Basically what this means is the officers and leadership are doing everything, and there's no opportunity for a member to actually grow themselves, whether professionally or personally, without being on an executive board. They feel like all they're good for is their money. And finally, the third thing is the chapter doesn't do enough blank. A lot of this comes from discussions at recruitment events. I'm really interested in community service. Oh, we do community service in Alpha Kappa Psi. Service is one of our core values. And yet we only do 2 events a year. Well, to someone who's interested in community service, they could join a different organization and do that a lot, but Alpha Kappa Psi is what they joined, and they're not getting it. So they lost a semester or a year of their time. And there are other reasons too, but the big one in this blue box is there's no presence of a buy-in. Getting people on board at the beginning, build in or buy in, depending on your perspective, matters. To tell someone, this is how it is, you're going to do it this way, is not a good way to get them to give up their time or their talent or their treasure in some cases to execute something. Another thing to keep in mind, especially right now that we're all virtual, is people have external obligations they have to focus on. School, caring for family members, having a job. These are things that conflict with Alpha Kappa Psi. And if they feel like the fraternity isn't giving them a chance to live their life outside of AKSI, they're going to leave. So in the past, I've spoken about the 15-70-15 rule. And over my time in the organization, I've kind of tweaked this to 10-80-10. Every organization can be broken down in this ratio, plus or minus a few percentage points. The first one is 10%. These are the top 10%. These are the people who are you guys all on the call right now in the middle of the day on Tuesday, learning about leading and managing high-performing chapters. You're intrinsically motivated. You don't need to be told why something has to happen. You do it because you want to do it, because you are getting out of the organization something bigger than you're putting into it, and you feel an obligation to duty or to service or to whatever. Then there's the middle 80%. These are the doers. These are the members that come to meetings, they attend, they give their ideas, they do everything they have to do, and they're a good, solid member. They might have other obligations. It might be in the student government. They might have a couple of jobs. It might be taking care of someone at home, and they'll still do stuff, but they won't necessarily be the ones that are going to every single event, and that's okay. These are the people that the top 10% really need to focus on to get the organization moving forward, because the bottom 10%, the dues payers, these are the ones that come to meetings all the time. They complain. All they have to do to say is be negative, but because they pay their dues, they are members in good standing, and therefore they have a voice too. It sounds sacrilegious in a fraternity, but these are the people that you can simply ignore. And I'm telling this from experience. If you can get 90% of an organization going in the same direction, then you will be good. If the top 10% focuses on the bottom 10% trying to get them back, that middle 80%, that number will shrink. This is the 80-20 rule you hear about in business all the time. So how do you build motivation in your members? You got to make sure people have a chance to do something and lead something outside of the people who were elected as officers. We talked about the functional versus the task and everything. Functional officers' jobs should be focused on the things that they're required to do. Only the treasurer and the president can sign checks, for example. So they have to do that. But if there's a fundraising event, the treasurer shouldn't be planning it. They should have someone in charge. Hey, can you plan an event on this date? And this is your goal, raise $300. And that gives someone the opportunity to say on their resume, I did this. 2, you want to make sure that people understand that the work they're doing matters. You can't just give someone a busy task. You have to say, listen, because you raised that $300 at that fundraising event, now we can afford to buy shirts for recruitment next fall and no one has to pay out of pocket for it. You just saved everyone in the chapter money because of your hard work. Also, give them metrics to track and then celebrate that. Hey, we gave you a goal of $300. You actually raised $400. So not only do we all get shirts, but all the food's paid for now too. Motivation matters. Communication matters even more. People will assume the worst if they don't have all the information. This is true in business. This is true in Alpha Kappa Psi. This is true in families. People will assume the worst if they don't believe that what you're doing matches in their head what they think you should be doing. And what that boils down to is trust and transparency. You can tell people bad things. And as long as they understand that you're telling them because you're telling them the information so they can be better informed and that you're going to try to address it, that's good. Keeping secrets in the organization, keeping secrets in Alpha Kappa Psi is not something that leads to high-performing chapters. It leads to rumors, it leads to drama, and it leads to chapters having fissures. The biggest place where this happens is between exec and the regular chapter members. A lot of chapter members don't know what exec does. They don't have a good clue onto what the officers do when they have their meetings and they focus on the business machinations of the organization. So making sure that you're taking minutes during exec meetings and emailing those out to your members, like here's what we talked about, will do a lot to build trust in leadership of the chapter. So to sum up, before we open up for questions, everyone in Alpha Kappa Psi has a job, and every job is different. It doesn't matter whether or not you're the president of the chapter or a newly initiated member, you have a job to do. Second, don't be afraid of changes in the size of your chapters. If you know you're losing a lot of members, and you also know that because of university restrictions, you can't do recruitment in the fall, you can plan for it. The shock happens when a big membership change occurs, either positive or negative, and you haven't figured out how we're going to address it from a management standpoint and a resource standpoint. 3, recruitment doesn't end at inducting your pledges. Remember, that's the beginning of the process, but it's all the time. A lot of chapters will focus all their efforts on the pledges and forget about the current members, and then those members die off because all they think about is, all this chapter cares about is pledges. And why they care about me, because now I'm here, but I'm not a pledge. And it boils down to the chapter's leadership is responsible for making sure that the chapter members feel like they're part of the organization, they have value, that they're being listened to, and they're being trusted. But they will not be motivated to do anything if they don't have that trust with their leadership. So that was a lot of slides, a lot of text, a lot of war stories. I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has that's on the video right now.
Perfect. Thank you, Mike. Like you said, that was a lot of really good information. We thank you for your time. So as I said earlier, if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the group chat and we'll pose those to Mike. Or if you want to ask it verbally, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Go ahead and kick it off with this first question here. So we probably have a lot of chapter officers on this call. What are some things that as officers can specifically do to lead their chapter and to kind of create that high-performing culture?
You always need to be looking for your replacement. And it sounds bad, especially if you're a brand new officer, but the worst thing that an officer can do, especially if you're the president of a chapter, is become irreplaceable. I can tell you from experience, there have been situations in Alpha Kappa Psi and work where I felt that I couldn't be replaced, and then I left and everything fell apart and the organization suffered. If people see you building the next generation of leaders, they will see that you are being altruistic and you are supporting the organization going forward. And in doing so, it's also important to not show favoritism. Everyone has that close friend they would love to backfill them when I graduate and you're going to take over my position. But if you show that there are 2 or 3 people that you're grooming to make them competitive, that's good. I recommend reading Winning by Jack Welch. He was a former CEO of GE, and it talks about his succession planning and how he became the CEO and his leadership style. But the point is that the organization groomed 3 people to be very competitive, so that way, no matter who was picked, they would succeed. If you're an officer in the chapter, your primary job is to do your job, and part of your job is to make sure the chapter exists after you leave. Yep.
Great, thanks, Mike. We did have a question in the chat here just about the recording, whether or not it'd be available, and the answer is yes. We will upload a recording of the video to YouTube on AK Psy's YouTube channel, so you'll be able to watch it there. Next question we have is, so how do you combat personal experiences and biases during voting?
It's a great question. So to say you're combating personal experiences when voting, it's not possible. No, everyone is made up of their personal experiences. Everyone's made up of their own biases. But looking at things objectively based upon what's being decided on matters. So just an example. We have someone who has, they've grown up in banks. Their parents run a bank and they've been doing balance sheets and accounting their entire life. And they live and breathe numbers. And they're running for VP of finance. But they're also kind of just not a nice person. Not saying they're a bad person, but they're kind of off-putting or whatever. And you're not friends with them. And they're running for the position. And then also your best friend's running for the role, and they haven't been able to pass micro accounting for 3 years. Not saying they're stupid, because I'm just saying they might not have a knack for numbers. Your personal bias is I want to vote for my friend. But if you pull back and think, what's best for the organization that I am a part of, is it that person who has experience, has grown up with this, and can do the best job? Don't think personal biases are something that are bad. They just frame how you think. There are actually some Alpha Kappa Psi sessions about unconscious bias and fighting it. Recognizing that you have biases is the first step in understanding that might be how you're flavoring something. And I think Rachel was raising her hand too.
Yeah, Rachel, go ahead if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Okay, so I have a question. So we're a relatively new chapter. We started in 2014, and they brought in that project management, committee chair roles. And when it first started, it really wasn't getting enough interest. But now that we've kind of revamped our chapter culture, we think it would be a great thing to bring back. Do you have any recommendations on how, what would be a successful way to present that to the chapter to get the most involvement, and again having members feel that they'll get an ROI from being more involved?
Absolutely. So the biggest way to sell someone on something is to give them some sort of currency for it, and I don't mean by money. If you have a committee chair who's a project manager, the way you sell them is, these are the skills you'll be able to put on your resume. These are the things you'll be able to manage. So on my resume, I can put, I was the project manager for blank. I was in charge of a $5,000 budget. I led a team of 5 people from 3 different majors. We executed this event, and those events led to the following impacts for the chapter. Because what you're telling them on is, this is the experience you'll get out of doing this role. Part 2 of that is you have to ensure that whatever officer function is overseeing that part of your chapter, it's not, or it's known very, very clearly that they are not going to just step in and do the job. And that's really, really hard to do. When you run for a position in Alpha Kappa Psi, you run for a position based upon the fact that you have ideas and experience, you want to do everything. And then in a properly managed chapter, you can step back and say, okay, my job is to manage. My job is to enable those on the org chart below me to do that actual work. So selling them on, these are the skills you'll get, and it's also a good training ground for future officer positions, can also help too.
Great, thank you.
All right, Mike, we have another question here. You may or may not be able to answer. So they're asking, what is a good number of pledges to get each semester if the university has about 30,000 students on their campus?
So the math that we use on average in Alpha Kappa Psi is about 80% of pledges that are inducted are initiated. And those numbers change from chapter to chapter. We have been trending over the past 5 to 6 years on a higher percentage, but that's the number we use to tell you what the induction number should be. So the question is, if you have a 30,000 student university, based on my personal experience, I'm not speaking for Alpha Kappa Psi, my personal experience, I would say your chapter should be probably somewhere in the range of 50 to 60 members, and you probably want to initiate 20-ish over the course of a year, depending on who's graduating, which means you need to induct about 30-ish over the course of a year. That would be my personal opinion based upon those numbers. Also keep in mind, though, some universities are not Greek friendly, and it's harder. Some universities are very Greek friendly, and there's lots of competition. So as much as it sucks to say it depends, it does depend, but that's my personal opinion on that math.
Yeah, so if you have any specific details about your specific chapter and what's going to work on your university with your current chapter size, best thing to do is talk it over with your chapter advisor, your regional director, and your chapter educational resource coordinator to find the best path for your specific chapter. Next question we have for you, Mike, here is, do you have any advice regarding director level positions and how they can balance the direction that they want to go with events and what members are valuing?
So you have to reverse engineer what events are being done based upon what the members actually want to do. And so there are two buckets of things that a chapter should focus on in regards to what they're doing. The stuff they have to do and the stuff they want to do. The stuff you have to do: recruitment, professional events, rituals. These are the things everyone does, everyone knows, and there's different webinars we can give you about how to do that properly. And there's the stuff that you want to do. And the trap that a lot of chapters fall into is they think that they talk about it with an exec, and there's that 7 to 10 group of people. Well, we want to do this, therefore the chapter wants to do this. It's not really the case. Surveying your members is crucial. Figuring out what it is they want to do, why they join the organization, and then saying, okay, these are the events we're going to do. Let's execute on those events. Something that chapters don't realize they have the power to do is you don't have to have the same committee chairs all the time. You have to have the same officers, because your officers are baked into your bylaws. Most chapters don't bake in hard to their bylaws what their committee chairs are supposed to be. I mention this because your committee chair should be based upon executing the events you want to do that year. That way, every person has a job. If you know you have a VP professional and that exists in your chapter as an officer position, that's cool. And your chapter says, we don't do enough faculty stuff. Okay, this year we should have a director of faculty affairs, and that person should do the following things: 2 events a semester, 1 event at the graduate level, 1 event at the undergraduate level. Do it again in the spring, but also focus on bringing in some faculty brothers too. You give them those constraints, those lanes in the road, you say what, and then you hire the directors either by exec committee appointment or whatever, and say, this is what needs to get done. You're responsible for figuring out what it is you have to do. The worst thing to do in any organization, not just Alpha Kappa Psi, is micromanage. If you trust people, you can tell them what you want done, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity. But telling someone how something has to get done, with exceptions, is a huge demotivator. And that's where directors might not feel like they have the leeway to do the events that they want to do.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. So we are over the 30-minute time that we set, so we are going to go ahead and wrap up with just the last question here, which is, how do you lessen the focus from the pledging process onto the current membership?
So chapters should have, personal opinion, 3 VP positions responsible for the 3 phases of a member's life: education, which is the pledging one; membership, current members; and alumni relations. Now, the alumni relations one is required in the bylaws, but your VP membership should be focused on, what do our current members need to do to feel included and feel involved? A lot of times it's figuring out, hey, we haven't done this type of event for a while, and you pass that requirement off to the VP professional or the faculty director. But if a chapter is focused just on pledging, that devalues the current members because they understand that they don't need me anymore, which is definitely not the case. Going to the fall semester, whoever's in charge of the actual active brotherhood is going to have a much more important job than has ever been done in the past, because chapters are either going to still be virtual, or they're going to lose a lot of people over the summer because they've lost their spring semester. And going back into the fall is going to be very, very difficult. I would say that the chapter should focus, again, personal opinion, especially going in the fall, like 80% on retaining current membership, keeping the current members happy and involved and engaged, and then let the pledge team work on the pledging stuff from the Bridge to Brotherhood and getting them initiated as members later on.
All right, thank you, Mike. So what last final piece of advice do you have for all of our attendees today?
So don't be afraid of change. Don't be afraid of growth. Don't be afraid of reduction. Alpha Kappa Psi is an organization that looks to people to be creative in finding solutions. And the goal of the organization is to develop principled business leaders. That means that your job is to grow as an individual and then leave your organization, your chapter, your region, your fraternity better for the next group that comes along in the future. If you focus on the fact that we're all members when it comes down to it, and you have that hat of humility on, then you'll go very, very far.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike, for your time and the great knowledge that you shared with us all about this topic. And also thank you, attendees, for joining in and asking some great questions to the presenter. So last reminder, go ahead and make sure you guys log into the MyAKSI community, where you can engage with other members in the collaboration groups and register for more upcoming events on the events tab. Thank you all for attending, and we'll see you in the MyAKSI community.
Thanks, everyone.